Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the March 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of Fascism is War by Georgi Dimitrov from 1936. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was written July 18, 1936. The source is Dimitrov, Georgi, Selected Works, Volume 2, Sophia Press, 1972, HTML transcription and markup by Matthias Bismo. It's hosted online at the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Excellent resource, hosts thousands of free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So Dimitrov was Bulgarian, and he was elected General Secretary of the Comintern, serving in that role from 1935 to 1943. During that time, there was a lot of discussion of the rising fascism in Europe, including this piece, and there's also a longer piece we have on the channel, Unity of the Working Class Against Fascism. It's more like a 2-hour file if you want the long version. That said, let's get into the audiobook. 2 years ago, in August 1935, the 7th Congress of the Communist International, in analyzing the internal situation and seeking ways and means whereby the working class could carry on the struggle against the offensive of fascism, pointed to the indissoluble connection between the struggle against fascism and the struggle for peace. Fascism is war, declared the Congress. Coming to power against the will and interests of its own countrymen, fascism seeks a way out of its growing domestic difficulties in aggression against other countries and peoples, in their redivision of the globe by unleashing a world war. As far as fascism is concerned, peace is certain ruin. The preservation of international peace renders it possible for the enslaved masses in the fascist countries to gather their forces together and to prepare for the overthrow of the hated fascist dictatorship, and to enable the international proletariat to win time for the establishment of unity in its ranks, to rally together the supporters of peace, and to establish an insurmountable barrier against the outbreak of war. When the 7th Congress characterized fascism as the firebrand of war, when it pointed to the growing danger of a new imperialist war, and to the need for establishing a powerful, united fighting front against fascism, there were very few people, even in the labor movement, who did not hesitate to accuse us communists of deliberately ascribing this role to fascism for purely propagandist purposes, and of exaggerating the war danger. Some did this consciously, in the interests of the ruling classes, while others did so out of political short-sightedness. The past 2 years, however, have provided a sufficiently clear demonstration of the complete absurdity of such accusations. Now, both the friends and foes of peace are openly speaking of the menace of a new world war which has come upon us, and it would be difficult to find serious-minded people who at all doubt that it is precisely the fascist governments that are foremost in the desire for war. In actual fact, war is already raging in a number of countries. For 1 year now, both the Italian and the German interventionists have been carrying on a war against the Spanish people before the eyes of the whole world. After having accomplished the seizure of Manchuria, the Japanese fascist militarists are now again attacking the Chinese people and are waging a new war in North China. Manchuria, Ethiopia, Spain, North China. These are stages toward the new great robber war of fascism. These are not isolated acts. There exists a bloc of fascist aggressors and warmongers: Berlin, Rome, Tokyo. The German-Japanese Anti-Comintern Pact, an agreement which, as is well known, is of a military nature, and to which Mussolini has in fact also linked himself, is already being applied in practice. Under the flag of a struggle against the Communist International, against the, quote, Red Menace, the German, Italian, and Japanese aggressors are trying by means of partial wars to seize military strategic positions, key positions on land and naval routes, and sources of raw materials for their war supplies with a view to the further unleashing of an imperialist war. There is no need to be under any illusions. There is no need to wait for a formal declaration of war to see that war is now on. As far back as March 1936, Comrade Stalin, in his interview with Roy Howard, said, quote, "War may break out unexpectedly. Nowadays, wars are not declared. They simply break out." unquote. All events of recent years serve as a glaring confirmation of this thesis. Without officially declaring war, Japan started military operations against China and seized Manchuria. Italy attacked the Ethiopian people and seized Ethiopia. And Germany and Italy are waging a war against the Spanish Republic. It is well known that the people have no desire for war, and that a number of non-fascist states are, in the present conditions, interested in maintaining peace. On what, then, do the fascist warmakers base their calculations? The entire experience following the robber drive by the Japanese imperialists into Manchuria and by Italian fascism into Ethiopia shows unquestionably that the bandit bloc of the rulers of Germany, Japan, and Italy, in order to carry out their military plans in practice, are striving, first of all, to hinder united action by the states interested in the maintenance of peace. Secondly, to prevent unity of action by the international labor movement, the establishment of a mighty united world front against fascism and war. And thirdly, to carry on undermining diversionist and espionage work in the Soviet Union, which is the foremost bulwark of peace. It is on this chiefly that the fascists base their calculations. And in actual fact, the fascist aggressors and warmongers are working strenuously and jointly in these three directions. They are blackmailing the Western European states by threatening their territorial interests. They are preparing an onslaught on the USSR. They are making extensive use of the appeasement of the ruling circles of Britain, France, and the United States. While making proposals for an agreement on the plundering of the small countries, Spain and China, they are striving in every possible way to win the good graces of the British Tories and a number of liberal and labor leaders so as to wean Britain away from France and other democratic countries. Holding out a similar lure, the fascists are exerting incredible efforts to come to an agreement with the French reactionaries so as to induce France to renounce the Franco-Soviet Pact, thus isolating it from the Soviet Union. The fascist states left the League of Nations to get a free hand for their aggression. They terrorized the weak states by threatening attacks from outside and by organizing conspiracies and rebellions within these countries. The fascist warmongers make use of traitors, and particularly of the Trotskyites, to carry on disruptive, disorganizing work in the ranks of the labor movement, to disrupt the People's Front in Spain and France. The recent putsch in Barcelona gave a particularly clear demonstration of how the fascists make use of Trotskyist organizations to stab the People's Front in the back. The fascist firebrands also make splendid use of the work of the opponents of international proletarian unity in the ranks of the Second International and the International Federation of Trade Unions, and assiduously recruit their agents everywhere. On more than one occasion, the Soviet Union has upset the war plans of the fascist aggressors by its consistent and resolute peace policy. It can be asserted without any exaggeration that mankind would long ago have been plunged into the most terrible war in history had not the Soviet Union been insistent and unswerving in carrying through its peace policy, had there been no glorious Red Army in existence. But while the fascist aggressor met with necessary rebuffs from the Soviet Union, which is acting in the interests not only of the Soviet people, but also of the whole of toiling mankind, this cannot be said of the countries of bourgeois democracy. Here, as is being demonstrated with particular clearness by the examples of Spain and China, we meet with the overt and concealed assistance being given to the fascist bloc by the ruling circles of the most important Western non-fascist states. Was it not support for the fascist warmongers when the seizure of Manchuria by the Japanese militarists was met with appeasement? Was not the lack of resolute resistance to the bloody campaign of Mussolini against the people of Ethiopia encouragement to the fascist aggressor? Take the entire farce of non-intervention in Spanish affairs, which has already been carried on for a year under the leadership of the British government, and the negotiations going on regarding the recognition of Franco as a belligerent. Are they not in fact an encouragement to the war being waged by the fascist states against the Spanish Republic? Is not the present complacent attitude toward the brazen marauders in North China the most scandalous encouragement to the unbridled Japanese militarists who wish to enslave the great Chinese people? How can the people of Great Britain, France, the United States, and the other non-fascist countries look on calmly at these things? How can they put up with this systematic appeasement and encouragement of fascist aggression, which facilitates the foul work of the fascist firebrands of a new world war? Now, I just have to comment here for a second. When you have a sentence like, how can the people of Great Britain, France, the United States, and the other non-fascist countries look on calmly at these things? I mean, it's not just that they were looking on calmly at those things in the specifically fascist countries. The United States, I mean, at this time in 1935, the things that the United States was doing at the time and had just recently done itself were, I mean, literally encouragement and a model for Nazi Germany to follow. Then there's the British Empire, I mean, a laundry list of things. France, also another colonial power, arguably less murderous than Britain or the US, but still pretty awful. So, I mean, I don't know if this sentence was written just as rhetoric to try to appeal to the better nature of the working class of these countries, but I mean, come on. Let's have at least some acknowledgement of, the absolute atrocities going on by these, quote, non-fascist countries at their hands. I mean, I know that, theory is theory and the application occurs in the real world where things are not neat and clean, things get messy, but for fuck's sake, this is imperialism. And, just because one thing is fascism and it's a particularly vile form of it, let's not forget about the rest of everything else going on in the world of big capitalist countries. Anyway, continuing. How can they put up with this systematic appeasement and encouragement of fascist aggression, which facilitates the foul work of the fascist firebrands of a new world war? Well, commenting again, I think we know how, and, again, as rhetoric, I think that this falls far short. Continuing. In the face of these things, it becomes still clearer how great is the historic responsibility which lies on those circles and leaders of the Socialist Labor International and the International Federation of Trade Unions, which are stubbornly resisting the establishment of united action by the international proletariat, of action by its organization on the basis of a united, coordinated policy against the fascist makers of the establishment of a mighty international front of peace. When the Japanese militarists seized Manchuria, there were people claiming to be leading lights in the labor movement who assured the workers in their organizations that Manchuria was a long way off, and the Japanese invasion did not touch on the interests of the international labor movement. When Mussolini's fascist hordes crushed the Ethiopian people, these functionaries asserted that the events in Ethiopia were a local colonial conflict, and that the international proletariat ought not to interfere. When later on the fascist aggressors brazenly attacked the Spanish Republic and started a war within Europe itself, it was only after many months of tormenting vacillations that the leaders of the Second International agreed to a joint conference with the delegation of the Communist International at Annemasse, and yet not for the purpose of actually bringing about united action between the international workers' organizations, but only to recognize the advisability of joint action, quote, wherever possible. Since then, the fascist intervention in Spain has been considerably intensified, and now there's been added the new aggression of the Japanese militarists in North China, which according to Japanese plans is to become a second Manchukuo and the basis for a further amputation of China. Is it not clear that at this moment, when the Spanish people are exerting all their efforts to beat back the onslaught of the fascist interventionists, when the Chinese people are rising up against the Japanese militarists who have attacked them, the international workers' organizations should at last unite their efforts and come to the defense of international peace, resolutely and fully prepared for action. The situation is now developing in such a way that to maintain peace throughout the world means first and foremost to bring about the defeat of the fascist invaders of Spain and China. They must be taught a good lesson. They must be really made to feel that the international proletariat and all progressive and civilized mankind will not tolerate their military aggression and acts of robbery, and are ready to do everything to prevent them from fulfilling their plans of igniting the flames of a new world war. Can it be that the Socialist Labor International and the International Federation of Trade Unions will rest content now with general, wordy declarations and incantations in favor of peace, while in deeds they shun joint action by all organizations of the international labor movement, which is so vitally needed? Surely it is clear that joint action by the international workers' organizations in each separate country and on an international scale is alone capable of mobilizing the forces of progressive mankind for a struggle against war, to bar the road to the warmongers, and also to exert pressure on the official policy of the most important non-fascist states so as to curb fascist aggressors who have thrown off all restraint. It is impossible to wage a serious struggle for the preservation of world peace unless first and foremost all necessary steps are taken to establish a united front of the working class in each country and united action by the international workers' organizations. It is impossible to carry on a serious fight for peace unless the forces of the labor movement and of the wide masses of the people are mobilized to drive the fascist usurpers out of Spain and China as rapidly as possible. The balance of the forces of war and the forces of peace is not what it was in 1914. Major world historic changes have taken place since that time. The imperialists succeeded in hurling millions of people into the inferno of a world slaughter under circumstances when neither a powerful proletarian state nor its Red Army existed, when there was no popular front in France and Spain, when the Chinese people were not in a position to defend their national independence, when the masses of the people had not had the experience of an imperialist war and a great proletarian revolution, when the international working class did not as yet possess such a world organization as the Communist International. The international labor movement has sufficient forces and means at its disposal to bring about the cessation of the intervention of German and Italian fascism in Spain, the onslaught of the Japanese militarists in China, and to secure international peace. This, however, requires that the tremendous forces and means at the disposal of the international labor movement be united and directed towards an effective and unyielding struggle against fascism and war. That's the end of the audiobook. So particularly in those last few paragraphs, with the outbreak of war between Russia and Ukraine and the beginning of the turning of the gears, possibly to go into something much bigger than that. For example, the United States just canceled $15.6 billion in pandemic aid and threw that money, $15 billion, instead into weapons for Ukraine, with the gears starting to clank towards some massive conflict between large capitalist states again. These warnings about it being impossible to carry on a serious fight for peace unless the forces of the labor movement and of the wide masses of the people are mobilized to drive out the fascist usurpers, and that the international federations of trade unions need to come forward with joint action in each separate country and on an international scale. So this is what I'm saying is the Bolshevik Revolution around World War I, exactly as Dimitrov cites here, that the balance of forces of war and forces of peace isn't what it was in 1914. Well, that was true in 1935, that the establishment of a large proletarian-led country like the USSR, federation like the USSR, and then China being on its way towards that, there were serious mobilizations of the proletariat as a highly organized, class-conscious, independent force, a force that could act independently of capitalists. Maybe not completely independently, because this world is interconnected. Until capitalism is completely exterminated, there's always going to be some dialectic between, there's going to be an interplay there. There's going to be some kind of concession and compromise. Capitalism will still have an influence until it is completely phased out by the class-conscious, organized, revolutionary proletariat. But the same way that things, weren't the same in 1935 as 1914, situation has changed again today. The USSR no longer exists. Russia is capitalist again and growing in its power. I mean, the economy of Russia and all of the USSR countries tanked after 1991, but now, 30 years on, Russia's rebuilding itself. is claiming more territory. It's inevitable that this capitalist power is going to clash with other alliances of even bigger capitalists, and this is the way it goes. In the current discourse of the last few weeks around the Russia-Ukraine and NATO in the background and partly in Ukraine war going on, that conflict, I see people with the slogan, disband NATO. That's a great slogan, but guess what? Typing slogans into the internet, into Twitter, into Facebook, whatever, literally means nothing. You have to get the united proletariat in organizations which can actually have some material effect on the world, shutting down supply chains for weapons of war, etc., actually organizing political movements which can put a stop to certain policies, that can at least slow them down, etc. This requires a tremendous amount of organization. And for the last several decades, that kind of organization at the national level and international level has not been in great shape. Hence, the capitalists can wage war, and the proletariat is not an independently organized force capable of independent action in our own class interests. This is what we need to rebuild. You can start by having anti-war protests and things, but it absolutely has to grow beyond that. You have to have people willing to engage in labor action, not just for better pay and conditions. Of course you do that, but beyond that, to advance our class interests in terms of geopolitics, to shut down capitalist wars, to refuse capitalist aggression, and to turn on the capitalist class, remove them from power, so that they don't have, their fingers on the buttons and levers of the global economy. That's the power that we as socialists are trying to take away from the capitalists. And this movement has had some very bad backslides that maybe now there is a growing conversation about, hey, this 2008 thing, wow, capitalism is as bad as ever. And more people are feeling the effects of that and starting to think about, what do we do to turn this around? Well, now you're seeing really capitalism starting to show its true face, as we're maybe seeing the beginnings of World War III coming together. This is an alarming time, and I gotta say, the agitation, education, and organization really needs to step up, because, like I said, typing slogans online, coming back to the disband NATO thing, how do you think that's going to happen? Disbanding NATO probably means disbanding capitalism. That's how you're going to get from here to there. But, the current state of disorganization, not having an anti-war plan or program, and not having the organizational capacity to actually enforce such a strategy if we had one, going from that current state that we're in to disbanding NATO. Yeah, I think there's probably 99 steps in the middle. Are you willing to take them? That's the question to the international working class. So I'm going to leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave questions, comments in the discussion area below. We'll pick it up there. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so I really appreciate those. If you like this channel and this content, thank me, but also thank a patron, because I've been able to do more content with their support than I would have been able to do without it. Otherwise, liking, sharing, subscribing, and leaving comments on the videos, even if they're just thanks or good video, all of that engagement helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm. The channel has been growing, so thanks to everyone for doing that. It's helped new people to become members of the audience and get exposed to this content who maybe wouldn't have seen it otherwise. So you're helping people's political education just by doing that. We do really have to expand this movement, and baseline education like this, I believe, is a step in that process, an important part of the process. Another very important part, like I was saying before, get organized. Join an organization, get active in real life. You have to do this, because online life is a bubble. You have to bring it to the community. So join an organization, even if it's DSA. If you can't fight the right wing of DSA, who can you fight? Nobody. Get out there, network with people. I would suggest looking for an organization which is larger rather than smaller, which has real ties to the community. which is engaged in some kind of real world, practical community work and organizing that you'd like to be a part of, that isn't just people sitting in a room talking about books. You can do that online, but in a real world organization, things like that. Also, that's a healthy organization that has good communications, responds to people within a short period of time, reasonably brief period of time, so that people think that it's active and that it actually can have some influence in real time on the world. Also healthy in the sense that people aren't getting super burned out and bitter, and that people like each other generally as comrades and get along with each other enough to do the work that can be so trying, stressful, and sometimes depressing. So a larger organization with ties to the community, doing real work, people get along, it's active, they respond to inquiries in a reasonable amount of time and a comradely way. If you can find or build an organization like that, then you're on the right track. And we have to do it, because what's the alternative? We see it before us. Austerity, police state, surveillance, war. That is the very bleak future which exists in the absence of socialist organizing. The historic duty of the international working class is to end capitalism, socialist revolution, taking power away from the capitalist class who privately own the capitalist economy and maintain the capitalist state for the purpose of maintaining and expanding capitalism, their class rule over the working class. We must dismantle that and build socialism in its place. Why? Because capitalism under stress turns to fascism, and, as Dimitrov said, fascism is war. Thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video.